Welcome to Pathways, Becoming Trauma Responsive, where we explore trauma through a compassionate lens, discover how these experiences affect each of us differently, and dive deeper into what it really means to become more trauma-informed. I'm your host, Dr. Elizabeth Meeker, Senior Director of the New York State Trauma Informed Network and Resource Center, funded by the New York State Office of Mental Health. The network advances the collective understanding of trauma, wellness and healing, and trauma-informed practices in action. This podcast is produced by CCSI. The views, opinions, and content expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the New York State Office of Mental Health or CCSI. Well, good morning, Cecily. It's so wonderful to have you on Pathways today. Really looking forward to our conversation. So just to get started, I was hoping that you could take a few minutes just to introduce yourself to our audience and tell a little bit about your background and who you are.
Yeah, sure. Well, good morning. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm so grateful for this opportunity to speak and, share my experience and my thoughts about trauma responsive practice. So I am Cecily Mitchell Harper. I'm a cisgender Black woman. I'm based in the New York City metro area. And truly, it's an honor and joy to share my story, to contribute to the ongoing and very important dialogue around wellness, well-being, trauma responsive practice. And I'm really grateful to the New York State Trauma Informed Network Resource Center for hosting this space. Personally, this is one of my favorite topics to talk about. So professionally, I'm a licensed social worker based in the state of New York with over 15 years of practice experience in children and youth services mainly. So I've worked in outpatient mental health clinics. I've worked in the child welfare system, school social worker, provide technical assistance to organizations and research centers. And currently, I'm a nonprofit consultant. I'm a wellness facilitator and an adjunct professor at Mercy University. I'm also a storyteller. So I believe in the power of storytelling as a liberatory and transformative practice. As Rebecca Solnit says, liberation is always part of a storytelling process, breaking stories, breaking silences, and making new stories. So that's a little bit about me. I don't know if you have any other questions about my background, but that's just kind of, a little bit about me.
Thank you. And, given your experiences over your career and also it sounds like personally, I am sure there's a lot of intersection with the trauma-informed work. And so usually when I meet someone who shares a passion around this work, they have the story of like the why, kind of what sparked for them the importance of getting into this space for the work that they do. And so, especially given that you're a storyteller, I would love to hear about your why.
Sure. Yeah. So I just want to start out, and this actually goes into, my introduction in terms of who I am. So I was trained, as a social worker, I was trained in trauma responsive practice. And, I'd done trauma therapy, working with children and families in the child welfare system. I've worked with, folks who have experienced severe trauma, complex trauma, and children who have experienced complex trauma. And so I learned all about that. And what I learned is the essence of trauma responsive practice. However, for me, I've come to see trauma responsive practice a little bit differently than what I was taught in school. So I'm going to share a little bit, and that's going to get into a little bit of my story and the why for trauma-informed practice. So when I think of trauma responsive practice, I think of wellness and well-being. To me, being trauma-informed recognizes and acknowledges that people are not well. So in whatever setting, whether that be a school, right, we're acknowledging students may not be well. So how can we create environments to support their wellness and well-being? Or if you're thinking of a human service organization, our clients and also service providers, are they well? So I think it's always the question, are we well, right? And society in general, are we well? So to me, trauma-informed practice is essentially a way of fostering and cultivating well-being at our deepest level so that we are well at our core. So before I go into why trauma-informed practice, trauma-responsive practice is important, I want to provide a conceptualization of well-being, and then I'll tie it back to trauma-responsive practice. So well-being, when I say that word, right, there's a lot of different definitions and people have different thoughts about well-being, what well-being is. So I want to kind of just clarify what I mean by well-being in this context. So when I say well-being, for me, well-being, I've developed a conceptualization of well-being that has two main sources of inspiration and foundation in two fields of study: community psychology and healing-centered practice. So within community psychology, this is the work of Isaac and Cora Pilotensky and their study of well-being. And then healing-centered practice, this is the work of Dr. Angel Acosta and healing-centered education, and Dr. Sean Dinwright, healing-centered engagement. So I see well-being as a holistic approach to ensuring that our deepest essence, we are well, and that we are connected. And so we are connected to ourselves, we're connected to each other, and we're also connected to the land and the earth. So well-being consists of personal, relational, and collective well-being. I think this is so important because in this society, we think of well-being as individual, right? I like to say that our society is hyper individualistic. Mm-hmm. Everything's about individual, right? It's, do you got yours. And we don't think about how we are connected to other people, yet we are intricately connected to each other. And we're also intricately connected to the earth. So well-being is acknowledging that intricate connection and fostering that. So well-being consists of self-care. Yes, that's important, and also consists of community care. And again, acknowledges that, well-being is tied to who we're in relationship with, the communities we're a part of, and also the land and the earth itself. So well-being truly, to me, is lift out the South African concept. So there's a South African concept called Ubuntu. I am because we are. So well-being is when we are deeply connected and rooted in who we are, and again, connected to our communities. So I have a mentor who always talks about this concept of being in right relationship. So I've really thought about that over the past couple of years. And I said, so to me, well-being is when we're in right relationship with ourselves, each other, and in community, and with the earth itself. Mm-hmm. So I think the other piece is that we cannot fully understand well-being and what it means to foster well-being without understanding the threats to well-being. So this is how I see well-being as connected to trauma-responsive practice. So I've come to see that the fundamental threat to well-being is oppression, racism, and white supremacy. Our modus operandi, right? That's the air we breathe, and that is the water we swim in. And so in order for oppression, racism, and white supremacy to thrive, it requires a disconnection. So we become disconnected from ourselves, disconnected from the earth, and disconnected from each other, and also disconnected from the earth itself. This is trauma. As Dr. Sean Dinwright, scholar and youth activist, who I said is one of my inspirations in terms of my conceptualization of well-being, he says, systemic oppression traumatizes everyone and the earth itself. So trauma. Again, there's many different definitions of trauma. There's a standard definition of trauma that I was taught in school. And within the past couple of years, as I become more grounded in trauma-responsive practice, healing-centered practice, and this conceptualization of well-being, I've understood trauma as a soul wound. So soul wound is an indigenous concept, and that means a fracture to the harmonious connection between the mind, body, and spirit. So indigenous communities recognize that there is a harmonious connection between our mind, our body, and our spirit. And if we're well, that harmonious connection is there. It's driving. It's good. When we're not well, there's a fracture to that. And to me, what I've come to see is that oppression, racism, and white supremacy in some ways could be the ultimate soul wound in which we live in a fractured state. We're fractured within ourselves, fractured from each other, and fractured from the earth itself. So well-being is a restoration, restoring the harmonious connection between the mind, body, and spirit. And reconnecting, when we do that, we reconnect with ourselves, we reconnect with each other, and we reconnect the earth and the land. So let's tie this back to trauma responsive practice. So in this definition of trauma, trauma as soul wound, a fracture to the harmonious connection, trauma responsive practice to me is a powerful way to restore the harmonious connection and to reconnect with ourselves, each other, and the earth. This, at its essence, is well-being. Mm-hmm. When we're fully restored and connected, and trauma responsive practice, true trauma responsive practice, fosters this.
Wow. Thank you so much. I'm just reflecting on so many things, and that you just kind of laid out, and kind of that redefining of what the why behind trauma responsive, and that importance of connectivity. And I think so much there's sometimes lip service around, when we hear things around DEIB and belonging, and very kind of superficial ways of connectivity. And what I hear you talking about is really deep work to do the restoration around connectivity.
Yes, yes. Thank you. And what you shared, a lot of times, and I've seen this right within the past couple of years, there is a lot of emphasis, which I think is great, on DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, right, anti-racism. However, what I've come to see is that if we're not careful, it ends up being kind of performative,
right,
and sort of just like a check the box, and that's not trauma responsive. Right. Trauma responsive is a deep sort of like, this is not performative. We're really trying to live this out. We're trying to embody that. And that's hard, right? And that's not a quick fix. Yep. That takes time. And I think it's the acknowledgement of, this takes time. This requires a new way of being. And I'll talk about that more as we go into our conversation. But I just wanted to, highlight something that you said in terms of the, that kind of performative aspect of it. And this really, to me, trauma responsive practice it's deep work.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think that is a good segue into what for you, what does this really look like in practice? And, as you described it, this is work that takes time, that runs against kind of the urgency of that's often present in a white supremacist culture, right? So it's not just the thing that we can check off and just do and go on to the next thing. We really have to take some time and intention around what these look like. So I would love to hear from you about kind of, in your mind and your experience, what this really looks like.
Sure. So trauma responsive practice is a culture and a climate that acknowledges trauma, right? And acknowledges trauma as a soul wound, and what works to foster healing from that soul wound. So when I think of trauma responsive practice, I think of healing centered practices, practices that heal the soul wound. So what are some of those practices? And, when I name these practices, these are actually pretty common practices, mindfulness, meditation, grounding. They seem quite simple, yet what I've come to see is that they're deeply powerful. So I'll share some examples within the context of my work. So within my work, I've been really trying to live out trauma responsive practice. Again, so that it's not performative, that I'm truly embodying trauma responsive practice. It's part of me. That's been my intention for the past several years, is how can I have this be part of me? And how can that then resonate and, ripple out into the environment, within the environment that I'm in? So I'm going to share again from the context of my work. So one example, I used to work for several years as the director of knowledge and learning at a collective intermediary organization located in NYC. So we worked with a network of youth-serving nonprofits, and part of my role, I was the initiative lead for the Creating Healing-Centered Communities Initiative. So this was a peer learning series supporting nonprofit staff to cultivating healing-centered cultures of care within their program. So to help me, I had an intergenerational team of 5, including college students, graduate students, and young professionals. And for me, I was really intentional about ensuring that our team embodied this healing-centered practice. So our initiative was creating healing centered communities. We're supporting nonprofit staff to do that. And for me, I told my team from day one, I said, well, we can't support nonprofit staff to do that if we don't live that out ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we on our team live this out? And so we were focused on not just doing the work, but being the work. So it's not just how are we doing the work, it's also how are we being together in the work.
Right.
So how are we together? This looks like co-creating and reflecting on community agreements, learning about our working and our learning styles. So in the beginning, when we first got started as a team, we really were intentional about developing community agreements, developing what we call community covenants, as well as learning about our working styles, our learning styles, right? Because we all learn differently, we all work differently, we all process things differently. So how can we create an inclusive environment? Part of that is inclusivity, right? How can we create an inclusive environment so that we all feel like we belong? The other thing is we began each team meeting and session with a grounding practice. So that could look like a simple meditation practice. Again, when I say simple, it's actually not simple, but sometimes it could be very short, 2-minute breathing meditation, guided meditation, or, a sensory countdown exercise, 5 things that you see, 4 things that you smell, etc. And then part of also what we did was we engaged in equitable decision-making processes, right? So to disrupt traditional power dynamics, specifically because, again, I was working with a group of young people. And so I really wanted to disrupt traditional power dynamics that we tend to find in spaces where young people are working alongside adult staff. So those are a few examples of how I did that within the work within my context in nonprofit work. And I also shared in the beginning that I'm also an adjunct professor. And so what I've started to do, I've really become more deeply versed in trauma responsive practices in higher education and bringing trauma responsive practices into the classroom. So part of that for me is bringing well-being practices into the classroom. I understand that if my students aren't well, they're not going to do their best.
Right.
So I work with undergraduate students. Right now, I'm working with freshmen. Next semester, I'll be working with juniors and seniors in the social work department. And so I start my class sessions with a grounding exercise. So I instilled from the beginning, right? The beginning of the semester, I instilled from the beginning the importance of wellness, caring for ourselves, especially because this is a social work program. And in social work, right, we're doing a lot of work that can contribute to secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue. So I want to instill with my students from the beginning, how do we take care of that? How do we take care of ourselves in the midst of that? So in my classroom, I seek to foster a safe and brave space. I bring in tenets of trauma responsive practices into my classroom. We start each class session with a check-in. We have a breathing exercise. It's just an opportunity to get in touch with themselves. So for example, I had a class yesterday. In the beginning of the class, I always start, we did a breathing exercise, grounded meditation, and then we did a meme check-in where I just have I think this one was animals, different types of animals and different facial expressions and just, and it was just like, where are you today? Where are you right now? And having the students, and I participate in this as well, and having the students just share out. And they can just share out where they are. They don't have to provide an explanation or they can pass. Again, that's just an example, right? And then we also have community agreements. And we recently did an activity early on. The semester is about to end. I can't believe it. But a few weeks ago, probably like halfway through the semester, we recently did an activity where we kind of did an assessment of how we're doing as a classroom community and how are we continuing to uphold and foster that safe and brave space. So that's just some examples of what that looks like. And I think the other thing that I want to mention that's important to mention here is that trauma responsive practice, right, healing the soul wound, explicitly recognizes and acknowledges that we all have intersecting and intersectional identities. So healing is not a one size fits all. Healing and well-being for some is not just a personal act, it's also a political act. So when we think of, we have to, in trauma responsive practice, I think to be truly trauma responsive, we have to think about, acknowledge the realities again, oppression, privilege, marginalization. And that for some communities, for some folks, depending on how they're situated within their social identities, within society, well-being is, some people are deemed as not worthy of well-being. So for example, as a Black woman, well-being was really not discussed when I was growing up. And society taught me from a young age, I feel like I was taught from a young age that my well-being, my wellness, how I was doing actually didn't matter. And I didn't realize that for so long. And I think it, you know, and sometimes in social work, when I was in social work, we didn't talk about self-care.
No.
You know, there was a lot of talk about trauma and working and advocating for our clients. But I kind of had this, you know, I didn't understand how to also take care of myself. I wasn't taught to do that. And so within the past couple of years, really being intentional about prioritizing my well-being, I've come to see that, wow, that's actually a political act. That's contributing to my liberation, as well as I think the liberation of society in our world. So I'm going to bring in Audre Lorde into this space. So she says, caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. So that's how I see trauma responsive practice, and some of the ways in which I've tried to, you know, bring that into my work and embody that in the space, in the spaces that I'm in.
Yeah, what I really heard is just so much around the intentionality and moving from the how to do it. And I've experienced that too, working with organizations. I want the strategies and things like that. And really, it's really about how you're showing up, the personal work that you've done, the space that you're creating with each other. And like the examples you shared really embrace the duality of the self-care with the we care, because you're creating community space that really supports that. And I also think that the importance of what you talked about with the intersection of identities, and also like just thinking about the caring professions and what we're taught, because I too came up, you know, as in my professional experience, didn't talk about self-care at all, wasn't a thing. And really the messaging was just, you know what you signed up for, pull up your bootstraps, show up again. You know, you just had something really traumatic that you might have been exposed to, and you go on to the next thing. And I think, you know, I'm so happy to hear that, like, what the spaces you're creating and what the students are hearing now, and hopefully that's happening in more spaces as they enter the field, that we really shift that dynamic, because the work happens through us. And, you know, if we're damaging ourselves, we're not going to be able to show up in the way we need to for the people we're trying to serve.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, I snap when I get excited or when things are resonating. So I'm snapping because I'm like, yes, definitely. Thank you for sharing. And that's very, you know, much resonates with me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, as you're thinking about the world as it is now, and the work that's happening and the awareness that's building, you know, how do you see the potential impact for this making a difference for individuals, for families, for community?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, I think that fundamentally, right, if I think about the world that I want to see, right, you know, if I think about the ideal world that I want to see, and to me, right, if we lived in a trauma responsive, trauma informed world, what would that look like? Well, fundamentally, I just want to name that racism, white supremacy, oppression, marginalization would just not exist. That would not be part of who we are and how we operate and how we are together in society. Unfortunately, that's a very big part of who we are, unfortunately. I want to see a world where that's not the case. And to me, when we move towards a more trauma responsive world, that can be possible. right? When we truly live out trauma responsive practice, as acknowledging the soul wound,
Mm-hmm.
right? White supremacy, racism as ultimate soul wound, and then also restoring that soul wound, restoring
Mm-hmm.
that harmonious connection. So I think that, when that happens, right, what we see is that we start being well.
Yeah.
So we're well. Personally, we're well.
Mm-hmm.
We're well in our relationships. Organizations are well. Schools are well. Society is well. We're well. We're not, I think of, again, a lot of my work is in nonprofits.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've come to see is nonprofits, there's this culture of urgency, culture of, like, we got to keep going, we got to keep going. And something that you said before really
Yeah.
resonated, particularly as if we're working human service providers, right? And we're doing direct practice, we're exposed to clients who have significant traumas and complex trauma. And we're just supposed to see that client and then on to the next one and on to the next one and on to the next one without enough time to reflect, without enough time to really check in with ourselves and each other around how are we doing? Are
Mm-hmm.
you okay? Am I okay? Right. And so we have this culture, unfortunately, I think it's changing though in some pockets.
Yeah.
And that's some of the work that I'm trying to do is that we have this culture of urgency and this culture of, all right, you just got to keep going, got to keep going. And what that does is actually, that's not trauma response. What's actually happening is you're recycling trauma.
Yeah. Mm.
Trauma is being recycled. Trauma is recycled. Trauma, obviously, we're working with clients who experience trauma, but then the staff are also traumatized because
Right.
they're experiencing their own secondary vicarious trauma that has not been dealt with. And,
Mm-hmm.
and also the environment is experiencing trauma.
Right.
So all of what's happening is just, recycling of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, trauma responsive practices is let's stop with that recycle.
Right.
Let's get well.
Mm-hmm.
And our clients cannot be well if we're not well in the spaces that they're in are not well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's also part of it. Part of it for me is also acknowledging that some of the systems that our clients are part of, particularly, again, in my context, field of work as a social worker, some of those systems are actually quite oppressive.
Mm-hmm.
And, and so how can we ensure that the spaces that they're in do not re-traumatize? And that's how we can work to foster their well-being as well as our well-being as staff and, the community.
Right.
And again, at a whole level, at a societal level, racism, oppression, all that just would cease to exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And yes, I love how you just also frame that recycling of trauma that can happen and really thinking about how do we create the systems and structures for that to be processed, like, right? Because that's like the movement from disconnection to connection, right? And so as long
Absolutely.
as we stay in this recycling cycle, we're just fostering more disconnection. And so really to be able to, how do we integrate these wounds and create those healing spaces so that we can foster that connectivity and have that wave of wellness ripple out? So yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah,
It's
I
a
love that.
beautiful space to imagine and think about how we can all do things today that can take us closer to that space.
I love that. Yeah, there's something that you said that just really resonated and struck home. I think it was waves of wellness.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, I just had this image. So thank you for sharing that. That's yeah, that's beautiful.
Oh, thank you. And, as we kind of bring our conversation to a close, I just want to give an opportunity. If there's, just additional if there's one final message or something that you'd like to share with our audience about kind of your work, your experience, something that you'd like them to kind of maybe take away.
Sure. So I think two things, and I kind of alluded to this throughout, our talk together this morning. One is when we think about trauma responsive practice and the question, right? So how do we get started? How do we do this? One thing is start small.
Mm-hmm.
I think we often think that, change has to be big,
Right.
right? But Adrienne Marie Brown, she has a book, Emergent Strategies. And Adrienne Marie Brown, they talk about small, right? The concept of being small.
Mm-hmm.
And they say small is good, small is all.
Mm.
So we start small and then that ripples out. So again, I kind of shared some examples in the beginning within my work. For some, that can seem like, oh, okay, you're doing a beginning your classroom with a grounding
Yeah.
practice. Great. It's not that, can seem small, can seem simple. To me, I actually see that as quite powerful
Right.
if you're continuing to do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you start small and that small ripples out and creates even bigger ripples, right?
Right.
And that's how that change happens.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing, which I talked about also, is the being, right? So it's not a way of doing, it's a
Mm-hmm.
way of being.
Yeah.
I remember when I first started doing trauma responsive trainings in schools and, human service, like out of school time programs, participants often were looking for, okay, so just give me a toolkit of practices. What do I have to
Yep.
do? And unfortunately, I had to tell them, well, I need to let you know that this is not a quick fix.
Right.
And this actually is not a toolkit of practices. We are changing how we are,
Mm-hmm.
not what we're doing. What we're doing actually the change in what we're doing comes from the change in how we are.
Yeah.
And that's harder. And that was a hard concept, I think, for especially teachers, right?
Yeah.
Who are like, just give me something that I can turn around in my classroom tomorrow.
Right.
And yes, I want to do that, but I also want to support you to have that mindset shift,
Yes.
right? Because that's where the deep change and that's where the deep work is going to come, and not because otherwise then it's going to be performative. So
Yeah.
I think, the aspect of truly being,
Mm-hmm.
and part of that is, I think anybody who's committed to trauma responsive work needs to be committed to trauma responsive work within themselves.
Yes.
And so for me, within the past couple of years, as I said, becoming really intentional about my well-being, taking care of myself, being in communities, I've really tried to, okay, how can I be well so that I can be in spaces where
Mm-hmm.
that resonates and that creates a shift.
Mm-hmm.
Grace Lee Boggs says, transform yourself to transform the
Yes.
world. So I think
Mm-hmm.
it really starts with us. We
Yes.
transform ourselves. We get right with ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
and then we're in right relationship with others. I just also want to close with, this concept of being
Mm-hmm.
and also starting small. So Valerie Kaur, who's an activist and scholar, she says, I want to make sure I have the quote. I love quoting, and then sometimes when I'm in the moment, I like forget the quote.
Mm-hmm.
She says, revolutions do not only happen in grand moments in public. Resolutions can happen in those, deep pockets, folks coming together to inhabit a new way of
Mm-hmm.
being. I probably botched that a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
but basically that's the concept, right? Of creating these small, deep pockets
Right.
where we're inhabiting a new way of being.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that I've been really, really inspired by the potential of these deep pockets
Mm-hmm.
to create change, transformative change.
Yeah, no, it just makes me think that, from that framework, it makes it the opportunity for everyone to kind of step into their power to create change, right? Because you can do that from wherever space you're in. And you
Absolutely.
don't have to wait for someone else or for permission, from an organization or an entity. You have the power to show up the way you want to show up. And that in and of
Absolutely.
itself can be hugely transformative. So
Yes.
yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I just want to thank you so much for this conversation today. I learned and inspired, and I think these, what you share will really resonate with our listeners and have things that can help them in their trauma responsive journey as well. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Yes, Elizabeth, thank you. Thank you so much. Really, again, appreciate the opportunity to share part of my story, to share my thoughts and perspective on a topic that I love talking about that's deeply, deeply personal. Just really appreciate, and also I just appreciate the New York State Trauma Informed Research Network Center for creating these spaces, right, where these conversations are happening and other folks can learn and grow together. So just really appreciate that. Thank you for having me and for the invitation to have a conversation with you this morning.
Thank you for joining us today. Please visit our website, traumainformedny.org, for additional trauma-responsive resources, events, and training opportunities. Subscribe to our podcast to be notified when our next episode is released.